The peoples of pre-dynastic Egypt were the successors of the Paleolithic inhabitants of northeastern Africa, who had spread over much of its area. During wet phases, they had left remains in regions as inhospitable as the Great Sand Sea. The final desiccation of the Sahara was not complete until the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. Over thousands of years, people must have migrated from there to the Nile Valley, the environment of which improved as the region dried out. In this process, the decisive change from the nomadic hunter-gatherer way of life of Paleolithic times to settled agriculture has not so far been identified. Sometime after 5000 BC, the raising of crops was introduced, probably on a horticultural scale, in small local cultures that seem to have penetrated southward through Egypt into the oases and the Sudan. Several of the basic food plants that were grown are native to the Middle East, so the new techniques probably spread from there. No large-scale migration need have been involved, and the cultures were at first largely self-contained. The preserved evidence for them is unrepresentative because it comes from the low desert, where relatively few people lived, as was the case later. Most people probably settled in the valley and delta. The earliest known Neolithic cultures in Egypt have been found at Merimda Bani Salama, on the southwestern edge of the delta, and farther to the southwest, in Al-Fayoum. The site at Merimda Bani Salama, which dates to the 6th-5th millennium BCE, gives evidence of settlement and shows that cereals were grown. In Al-Fayoum, where evidence dates to the 5th millennium BC, the settlements were near the shore of Lake Qarun, and the settlers engaged in fishing. Merimda is a very large site that was occupied for many centuries. The inhabitants lived in lightly built huts. They may have buried their dead within their houses, but areas where burials have been found may not have been occupied by dwellings at the same time. Pottery was used in both cultures. In addition to these Egyptian Neolithic cultures, others have been identified in the Western Desert, in the Second Cataract area, and north of Khartoum. Some of these are as early as the Egyptian ones, while others overlapped with the succeeding Egyptian pre-dynastic cultures. In Upper Egypt, between Asyut and Luxor, have been found the Tajian culture, named for Deir Tassa, and the Badarian culture, named for al-Badari. These date from the late 5th millennium BC. Most of the evidence for them comes from cemeteries, where the burials included fine black-topped red pottery, ornaments, some copper objects, and glazed steatite beads. The most characteristic pre-dynastic luxury objects, slate palettes for grinding cosmetics, occur for the first time in this period. The burials show little differentiation of wealth and status, and seem to belong to a peasant culture without central political organization. Probably contemporary with both predynastic and dynastic times are thousands of rock drawings of a wide range of motifs, including boats, found throughout the eastern desert, in Lower Nubia, and as far west as Mount Uwainat, which stands near modern Egypt's borders with Libya and Sudan in the southwest. The drawings show that nomads were common throughout the desert, probably to the late 3rd millennium BC, but they cannot be dated precisely. They may all have been produced by nomads, or inhabitants of the Nile Valley may often have penetrated the desert and made drawings. Naqada I, named for the major site of Naqada, but also called Amrashan for Al-Amira, is a distinct phase that succeeded the Badarian. It has been found as far south as Al-Qawm al-Amar, Hierakonpolis, ancient Egyptian Nekhen, near the sandstone barrier of Mount Silsila, which was the cultural boundary of Egypt in Predynastic times. Naqada I differs from its Badarian predecessor in its density of settlement and the typology of its material culture, but hardly at all in the social organization implied by the archaeological finds. Burials were in shallow pits in which the bodies were placed facing to the west, like those of later Egyptians. Notable types of material found in graves are fine pottery decorated with representational designs in white on red, figurines of men and women, and hard stone mace heads that are the precursors of important late Predynastic objects. Nakata II, also known as Gurza for Gurza, Jirza, is the most important pre-dynastic culture. The heartland of its development was the same as that of Nakata I, but it spread gradually throughout the country. South of Mount Silsila, sites of the culturally similar Nubian group are found as far as the Second Cataract of the Nile and beyond. These have a long span, continuing as late as the Egyptian early dynastic period. During Nakata II, large sites developed at Al-Qawam al-Amar, Nakata, and Abydos, showing by their size the concentration of settlement, as well as exhibiting increasing differentiation in wealth and status. Few sites have been identified between Asyut and Al-Fayoum, and this region may have been sparsely settled, perhaps supporting a pastoral rather than agricultural population. Near present-day Cairo at Al-Umari, Al-Ma'adi, and Wadi Dija, and stretching as far south as the latitude of Al-Fayoum, are sites of a separate contemporary culture. Al-Ma'adi was an extensive settlement that traded with the Middle East and probably acted as an intermediary for transmitting goods to the south. In this period, imports of lapis lazuli provide evidence that trade networks extended as far afield as Afghanistan. The material culture of Nakata II included increasing numbers of prestige objects. The characteristic mortuary pottery is made of buff desert clay, principally from around Kina, and is decorated in red with pictures of uncertain meaning showing boats, animals, and scenes with human figures. Stone vases, many made of hard stones that come from remote areas of the eastern desert, are common and of remarkable quality, and cosmetic palettes display elaborate designs with outlines in the form of animals, birds, or fish. Flint was worked with extraordinary skill to produce large ceremonial knives of a type that continued in use during dynastic times. Sites of late Nakata II, sometimes termed Nakata III, are found throughout Egypt, including the Memphite area and the Delta region, and appear to have replaced the local Lower Egyptian cultures. Links with the Middle East intensified, and some distinctively Mesopotamian motifs and objects were briefly in fashion in Egypt. The cultural unification of the country probably accompanied a political unification, but this must have proceeded in stages and cannot be reconstructed in detail. In an intermediate stage, local states may have formed at Al-Qawam al-Amar, Nakata, and Abydos, and in the Delta at such sites as Budo, modern Qawm al-Farah and says Al-Ajar. Ultimately, Abydos became preeminent. Its late Predynastic cemetery of K-Abwaz extended to form the burial place of the kings of the First Dynasty. In the latest Predynastic period, objects bearing written symbols of royalty were deposited throughout the country, and primitive writing also appeared in marks on pottery. Because the basic symbol for the king, a falcon on a decorated palace facade, hardly varies, these objects are thought to have belonged to a single line of kings or a single state, not to a set of small states. This symbol became the royal Horus name, the first element in a king's titulary, which presented the reigning king as the manifestation of an aspect of the god Horus, the leading god of the country. Over the next few centuries, several further definitions of the king's presence were added to this one. Thus, at this time, Egypt seems to have been a state unified under kings who introduced writing and the first bureaucratic administration. These kings, who could have ruled for more than a century, may correspond with a set of names preserved on the Palermo stone, but no direct identification can be made between them. The latest was probably Narmer, whose name has been found near Memphis, at Abydos, on a ceremonial pallet and mace head from Al-Qawam al-Amar, and at the Palestinian sites of Tall Gate and Arad. The relief scenes on the pallet show him wearing the two chief crowns of Egypt and defeating northern enemies. But these probably are stereotyped symbols of the king's power and role, and not records of specific events of his reign. They demonstrate that the position of the king in society, and its presentation in mixed pictorial and written form had been elaborated by the early 3rd millennium BC. During this time, Egyptian artistic style and conventions were formulated, together with writing. The process led to a complete and remarkably rapid transformation of material culture, so that many dynastic Egyptian prestige objects hardly resembled their forerunners. The early dynastic period, 2925 to 2575 BC. The First Dynasty, 2925 to 2775 BCE. The beginning of the historical period is characterized by the introduction of written records in the form of regnal year names, the records that later were collected in documents such as the Palermo stone. The first king of Egyptian history, Menes, is therefore a creation of the later record, not the actual unifier of the country. He is known from Egyptian king lists and from classical sources, and is credited with irrigation works and with founding the capital, Memphis. On small objects from this time, one of them dated to the important King Narmer, but certainly mentioning a different person, there are 2 possible mentions of a man who may be the King Menes. If these do name Menes, he was probably the same person as Aha, Narmer's probable successor, who was then the founder of the First Dynasty. Changes in the naming patterns of kings reinforce the assumption that a new dynasty began with his reign. Aha's tomb at Abydos is altogether more grandiose than previously built tombs, while the first of a series of massive tombs at Aquara, next to Memphis, supports the tradition that the city was founded then as a new capital. This shift from Abydos is the culmination of intensified settlement in the crucial area between the Nile River Valley and the Delta. But Memphis did not yet overcome the traditional pull of its predecessor. The large tombs at Aquara appear to belong to high officials, while the kings were buried at Abydos in tombs whose walled complexes have long since disappeared. Their mortuary cults may have been conducted in designated areas nearer the cultivation. In the late Predynastic period and the first half of the First Dynasty, Egypt extended its influence into southern Palestine and probably Sinai and conducted a campaign as far as the Second Cataract. The First Cataract area, with its center on Elephantine, an island in the Nile opposite the present-day town of Aswan, was permanently incorporated into Egypt, but Lower Nubia was not. Between late Predynastic times and the Fourth Dynasty, and probably early in the period, the Nubian group came to an end. There is some evidence that political centralization was in progress around Qustul, but this did not lead to any further development, and may indeed have prompted a preemptive strike by Egypt. For Nubia, the malign proximity of the largest state of the time stifled advancement. During the First Dynasty, writing spread gradually, but because it was used chiefly for administration, the records, which were kept within the floodplain, have not survived. The artificial writing medium of papyrus was invented by the middle of the First Dynasty. There was a surge in prosperity, and thousands of tombs of all levels of wealth have been found throughout the country. The richest contained magnificent goods in metal, ivory, and other materials, the most widespread luxury products being extraordinarily fine stone vases. The high point of First Dynasty development was the long reign of Den, flourished 2850 BC. During the First Dynasty, 3 titles were added to the royal Horus name: 2 ladies, an epithet presenting the king as making manifest an aspect of the protective goddesses of the south, Upper Egypt, and the north, Lower Egypt, Golden Horus, the precise meaning of which is unknown, and Dual King, a ranked pairing of the 2 basic words for king, later associated with Upper and Lower Egypt. These titles were followed by the king's own birth name, which in later centuries was written in a cartouche. The Second Dynasty, 2775 to 2650 BCE. From the end of the First Dynasty, there is evidence of rival claimants to the throne. One line may have become the Second Dynasty, whose first king's Horus name, Hetepsekemwi, means peaceful in respect of the two powers and may allude to the conclusion of strife between two factions or parts of the country, to the antagonistic gods Horus and Seth, or to both. Hatepsut and his successor, Reneb, moved their burial places to Akkara. The tomb of the third king, Ninager, has not been found. The second half of the dynasty was a time of conflict and rival lines of kings, some of whose names are preserved on stone vases from the Third Dynasty step pyramid at Akwaka or in king lists. Among these contenders, Peribsen took the title of Seth instead of Horus, and was probably opposed by Horus Kasakem, whose name is known only from Kalm al-Amar, and who used the programmatic epithet effective sandal against evil. The last ruler of the dynasty combined the Horus and Seth titles to form the Horus and Seth Kazakemwi, a rising in respect of the two powers, to which was added the two lords are at peace in him. Kazakemwi was probably the same person as Kasakem after the successful defeat of his rivals, principally Peribsen. Both Peribsen and Kazakemwi had tombs at Abydos, and the latter also built a monumental brick funerary enclosure near the cultivation. The Third Dynasty, 2650 to 2575 BCE. There were links of kinship between Kazakemwi and the Third Dynasty, but the change between them is marked by a definitive shift of the royal burial place to Memphis. Its first king, Sanakht, is attested in reliefs from Megara in Sinai. His successor, Dusser, Horus named Nechereket, was one of the outstanding kings of Egypt. His step pyramid at Akwara is both the culmination of an epic and as the first large all-stone building, many times larger than anything attempted before the precursor of later achievements. The pyramid is set in a much larger enclosure than that of Kazakemwi at Abydos, and contains reproductions in stone of ritual structures that had previously been built of perishable materials. Architectural details of columns, cornices, and moldings provided many models for later development. The masonry techniques look to brickwork from models and show little concern for the structural potential of stone. The pyramid itself evolved through numerous stages from a flat mastaba, an oblong tomb with a burial chamber dug beneath it, common at earlier non-royal sites, into a six-stepped, almost square pyramid. There was a second, symbolic tomb with a flat superstructure on the south side of the enclosure. This probably substituted for the traditional royal burial place of Abydos. The king and some of his family were buried deep under the pyramid, where tens of thousands of stone vases were deposited, a number bearing inscriptions of the first two dynasties. Thus, in perpetuating earlier forms in stone and burying this material, Djoser invoked the past in support of his innovations. Djoser's name was famous in later times, and his monument was studied in the late period. Imhotep, whose title as a master sculptor is preserved from the step pyramid complex, may have been its architect. He lived on into the next reign. His fame also endured, and in the late period he was deified and became a god of healing. In Manetho's history, he is associated with reforms of writing, and this may reflect a genuine tradition, for hieroglyphs were simplified and standardized at that time. Djoser's successor, Sekhemket, planned a still more grandiose step pyramid complex at Akkara, and a later king, Kaba, began one at Zoyet al-Aryan, a few miles south of Giza. The burial place of the last king of the dynasty, Huni, is unknown. It has often been suggested that he built the Pyramid of Medum, but this probably was the work of his successor, Snefru. Inscribed material naming Third Dynasty kings is known from Megara to Elephantine, but not from the Middle East or Nubia. The organizational achievements of the Third Dynasty are reflected in its principal monument, whose message of centralization and concentration of power is reinforced in a negative sense by the archaeological record. Outside the vicinity of Memphis, the Abydos area continued to be important, and 4 enormous tombs, probably of high officials, were built at the nearby site of Beit Khalaf. There were small, non-mortuary step pyramids throughout the country, some of which may date to the 4th dynasty. Otherwise, little evidence comes from the provinces, from which wealth must have flowed to the center, leaving no rich local elite. By the 3rd dynasty, the rigid structure of the later nomes, or provinces, which formed the basis of Old Kingdom administration, had been created, and the imposition of its uniform pattern may have impoverished local centers. Tombs of the elite at Ankara, notably those of Hezira and Kabasakar, contained artistic masterpieces that look forward to the Old Kingdom. If you like our videos, then share with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more interesting videos.